Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the SNHU History Speaker Series, which brings together professional historians, students, faculty, and staff to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. At this event, I spoke with Elisabeth Davis, who wrote a book on Native American boarding schools during the 19th century, and is about to publish a second book on Laura Ingalls Wilder, the community around her, and what that story has to say about the development of the American West. So come closer so you can listen in. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the February 11th History Speaker Series. Today we're talking with Dr. Elisabeth Davis. I am Rob Denning. I'm the Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University. I oversee the history programs, the online history programs here at SNHU, and I'm happy to be speaking with Dr. Davis. So Dr. Elisabeth Davis earned her PhD in history at the University of Buffalo. Her research focus is largely on women, religion, and race in the 19th century, and her recent focus has been on the native boarding schools. And so tonight we're going to be talking to Dr. Davis about her career, her role as a teacher, I assume, and then we'll probably talk about the research and the book. We've got lots of things to talk about. So Elisabeth, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself beyond the bare bones bio that I just read off there?
So hello, thank you for having me. So I am kind of like a history geek since I was a child. When I was little, I could literally name the kings and queens of England by the time I was 5. I was that level of history nerd. I can't do it anymore, but I could then. And I always knew I was going to be something in history. At one point, I was like, I'm going to be a Broadway performer, and I'm nearly 6 foot tall, so that's just not going to happen. But I always was like, I'm going to minor in history or something. And I just decided, you know what, it's going to be history the entire way. And when I started undergrad, I was going to be a medievalist. So I wanted to focus in on approximately 400 to 1400. And then I got to my first master's degree, which was in history, and suddenly became an early modernist. So I was looking about 1400 to 1789. And then I started my PhD and became a 19th centuryist somehow. I don't know how. And then I also actually have a master's in library science. So all over the place. But I am the consummate history geek. I love doing research in everything. So most of my research is on the Native American schools, but I have a book coming out hopefully early next year on Laura Ingalls Wilder. So just all over the place.
All right. And yeah, I know the feeling about jumping from time period to time period. My MA thesis was on the 19th century, but my dissertation was on the 20th century. So it's not quite as dramatic a jump as yours, but yes, we tend to jump around all the time. We always think that we know what our specialty is, and then something comes up that we think is really cool, and suddenly our specialty is just multiplied.
Yep.
Yeah, so we mentioned earlier, or I mentioned the book that you've written already, which was on the Native American boarding schools. That one's called Catholic Sisters: Narratives of Authority and the Native American Boarding Schools, 1847 to 1918. You mentioned you've got another book coming out, which I'm fascinated to hear about. But before we get to that one, let's talk about the previous book. And so, can you tell us about this Catholic Sisters book? Where did this idea come from? And tell us a little bit about the story.
So I grew up about 30-minute Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Carlisle, Pennsylvania is the home of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which ran from the 1870s to 1918. And I've been slightly obsessed with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School since I was 7 years old. And I was the only person who knew about this. I'd found out about it randomly in a book. And I never thought I would actually do research on the Native American boarding schools. My dissertation was on was on power struggles between Catholic sisters. People call them nuns, they're actually sisters. So Catholic sisters and priests. And I was looking at these power struggles in my dissertation. And I wrote my dissertation as a series of articles. And I always meant it to be articles. I never meant it to be a book. And so I defended about 2 weeks before COVID shut University of Buffalo down. And I'm like, okay, I need something else. What do I want to do? I want to do something with Catholic sisters. And so nearly 6 years ago to the day, I was sitting on the bed and I had my laptop on my knees and I was doing what everyone does. They go when they're bored. They go to Chronicling America, which is this wonderful newspaper database. I know everyone does this,
Sure. Sure.
And I was looking up this one group of Catholic sisters. Their names are the Sisters of St. Joseph, and I'd done my first article was on them. They featured heavily in my dissertation. And I came across this article from 1893 that said the Sisters of St. Joseph, nuns basically, had deposed the democratically elected chief of a native community. And I'm like, wait, what? How can sisters, what? How can sisters depose the democratically elected chief of a native community? They're not the government. What the heck is going on here? And so I looked at my husband. I said, this is my next research. And so it took me a while to get to them. I published 3 articles on Carlisle in the interim because I got on a little sidetrack because I was doing my secondary research going into a book on the Sisters of St. Joseph and found a footnote that said that the Sisters of St. Joseph were at Carlisle. So I'm like, oh, I have to do this. And 3 articles later, I finally get to there. Then came the book. And the book looks at the history of Catholic sisters, Catholic nuns, and their role on Native American boarding schools, but also mission schools. And these are just day schools that Native students were sent to. And I start with the first group of sisters in the United States to run one of these schools. And this is the Sisters of Loretto in Kansas. And then I look at different groups across the US all the way through 1918. And I stop in 1918 just because Carlisle closed in 1918. And so that's just a really nice breaking off point. And I'm a 19th centuryist. I'm a long 19th centuryist. We don't like going past 1918. It's like 20th century.
Yeah.
So the book looks at what role did these sisters play at the boarding schools, but also what stories are they telling about their work there. So what is really in the convent archives? And so one of the schools I looked at is in Oklahoma, and the convent archives are just full of letters about where are we going to get money? How are we going to get money? The federal government promised us money. Well, they're not giving us money. So what are we going to do now? And so that chapter's on there. I have a chapter on the Sisters of St. Joseph and how they actually did figure out a way to depose a democratically elected leader of a local tribal community. And I have an article on that too. I have a chapter on another group in Minnesota and how they are having their students perform for people. They're inviting people to this boarding school and just doing these performances. So what does that mean? What are the stories that come from this? And how do we see it as a form of settler colonialism, imperialism, and all of that? And so the book is quite short. I intentionally wrote it short, but I've been expanding upon it. And I actually have an article coming out later this year on death culture at one of the Native American boarding schools for the Catholic sisters. So I'm still doing a lot of research in there.
When you say that one of the schools was having their students put on performances, are we talking like reenactments of Native American ceremonies, or what kind of performances were they doing?
They're kind of all over the place. So some of it are these reenactments of ceremonies, which the sisters are actually writing. So they're not actually reenactments. The sisters are getting stories and then writing these scripts, and the students are performing them. Some of it is the first contact between Europeans and Native communities. Some of it is just dress up and walk around. But some of the performances are actually the students saying, look, I'm going to wear white clothes and I'm going to show you that I am assimilated, that I have become part of white culture, and I'm going to speak, I'm going to recite a poem or something like that. And it's a way to actually raise money to say, look how well our boarding school's doing in this process of assimilation.
And with these schools that were kind of scattered across the country, I mean, I just looking at the table of contents in your book, you've got schools in Kansas, in Oklahoma, Minnesota. So if you've got these schools happening in different areas of the country, are these all guided with the same kind of philosophy, or are they all kind of independently run? Or, I mean, I imagine they're all run by the Catholic Church, sure, but is there like coordination between these schools on how they're handling relationships with Native Americans and all that?
So there's this kind of misconception that the Catholic Church is one unified group, and it's not. It's actually very, very localized in the US. So all of the groups that are there have independent contracts with the federal government. And so they're all in contracts to get funds to run the schools with the federal government. And how they run the schools differ. So some of the schools focus more on religious education, others focus more on an industrial education. So how to be a farmer, how to work in the factories, that type of thing. But there is a group that kind of coordinates, and that's known as the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, which is founded in 1874. And so they're the ones who are doing like the one-on-one negotiations with the State Department and the Department of the Interior versus the Catholic sisters who have to send them mail and say, hey, I need you to renegotiate our contract because I have 50 students, but they only gave me money for 20 students. So the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions is kind of there. It's collecting the data. All of the records for the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions is actually at Marquette University, and it used to be on these massive microfilms, and there were hundreds of them. And in the past 9 months, they've digitized them all, and it made everyone's life so much easier. So there is this overarching community that's doing the negotiations, but how the schools are run is very up in the air.
So tell us about your, your professional career. So you, after you got your PhD, obviously you're teaching now, but how'd you get from there to there?
So when I was it's called ABD, so about to be dissertated. So I'd done all of my coursework and I was working my dissertation. I actually received a I'm going to call it a cold call, shall we say, a cold email from a department chair at a school about an hour away from where I was doing my work. And he said, hey, I'm looking for people to adjunct. Are you interested? And I went, yeah, totally. And so I was adjuncting full time at this other school, and it was something like a 5-5 load. It was a crazy load.
For an
And I
adjunct?
was,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
And then I was adjuncting at a community college. And while this was happening, COVID had hit just after I did my dissertation. So I was like, oh, I'll have a science degree. Why not? And adjuncting. And so my first job after adjunct was actually as a librarian. And
Hmm.
then while there, I said, you know what, I have my PhD, I want to be a professor. And so I started applying, and I was a visiting professor at University of Connecticut for a year, and have done a variety of visiting professorships right now. And I'm still going for the tenure track position because one of the things you realize is that it's very difficult in the tenure track position, that they're dying out very quickly. And so my cohort from grad school, most people either went into administrative work or became librarians. And I had the library science degree, so I can do work either way. But it's one of those things where it's so hard to find a tenure track position in history. And so people are either on short-term contracts or they're jumping into other careers while still doing research.
Yeah, that's about the same for my cohort in grad school. I want to say, we started off, well, my cohort started off with 25, and we probably had 15 by the time we got to graduation. And then about maybe half of them were able to find tenure track type jobs, and others went into um, either higher ed admin or just outside of academia completely. But yeah, it is a pretty high attrition rate for historians.
Yeah, and that's true for all the humanities because I know people in English, or a really good friend of mine is an archaeologist
Yeah.
and has actually just been doing adjuncting at 5 different schools at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where I was for a while. I was doing adjuncting multiple positions for a long time. Yep. All right. Let's talk about your new project. So you mentioned Laura Ingalls Wilder, right?
Yeah.
So what's attracting you to that, and where are you going to go with it?
So like many people, I grew up on the Little House books and so obsessed. Yeah, totally. I can recite books by heart. And so I was goofing around on Chronicling America for some reason. And I went, I feel like just looking up the different people in the books. And I came across a newspaper article on Laura Ingalls Wilder's father, Charles Ingalls. And I went, wait a minute, wait, what? And I started going through like these other books that had been written on her and her family. And I went, no one has covered this at all. And you're going to have to buy the book to find out what it is. But I started going through and I started spending a lot of time looking at her family on all of these newspapers. And I went, wait a minute, there's a story here. And so I wrote the introduction and I pitched it to University of Nebraska Press, who gave me a first round contract. Basically, what happens is I had to write the whole book, send it to them, and it went out for peer review. Just actually got the peer reviews back today. They're all very good. So I have to go through,
Nice.
and so they have to go through another round and have to be presented to their board of editors. And if they approve, I have a final contract, and there will be a book coming out hope next year on Laura Ingalls Wilder. And so the purpose is to look at these newspaper articles that people just aren't looking at and try and see, okay, what does this tell about the lives of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family? So I have a chapter on her father, for example. I have a chapter on her husband because no one's talked about Almanzo Wilder. He's just kind of this like tall, dark, handsome figure in the side. Well, what do newspaper articles tell us about him? And then what do they tell us about her, particularly when she got older? Because we have this idea of this prairie girl going out and running about the prairies, and then this writer. Well, in reality, she is this amazingly shrewd businesswoman. And the newspaper articles are actually telling us about how shrewd she is as a businesswoman. And so, just trying to historicize. I have articles on Mary Ingalls, and I realized that people talk about Mary Ingalls a little bit because she's blind, but nobody's actually done a disability study on her. And so one of my chapters, Mary Ingalls and disability, and what would her life have been like? What her perceptions have been like? And then how does that correspond with how Laura Ingalls Wilder described her sister in her books? And she's actually pushing back against the disability narrative that we can see in Mary's life. So it's my passion of love. It's my passion project.
So when you're talking about newspaper articles, you're talking about contemporaneous articles written about them by just local journalists or national journalists or all of the above?
Local. So it
Local.
is very local. I was curious to see if some of the books would be mentioned, and I didn't see like all of these advertisements for books. I did find a national journal that mentioned Laura Ingalls Wilder's death, and it was very in passing, like Mrs. Wilder died. It was 2 lines, and
Yeah.
so most of it are these little local newspapers that some of which are used to actually be in archives, and now they've been digitized so anyone can get hold of them and read them. And it's really fascinating because some of these newspaper articles I don't think anyone's looked at before, that they just didn't even think, because Chronicling America, their search engine is so great and it just pulls from everywhere. They haven't been able to look. So it's been so much fun to do the research and the writing on it.
And how many articles we're talking about? We're talking about like a large collection. So I was trying to get a sense of the local press covering her. Was it because she was a local celebrity and so she just kind of attracted a lot of attention that way, or was it because of genuine interest in her writing style, philosophy? What was the motivation for all these articles?
So in terms of her, all the articles are actually about all the articles that I focused in on are really about her before she wrote her books. So
Hmm.
when she started publishing, they would actually mention her daughter, and it would be, oh yes, and Mrs. Wilder also published something. But we're really going to focus in on Rose Wilder Lane because Rose Wilder Lane was the celebrity. in Mansfield, Missouri, where Laura Ingalls Wilder ended up settling. So most of the things that are about Laura Ingalls Wilder are, oh, she hosted a Halloween party at Rocky Ridge Farm, or oh, she is the vice president and treasurer of a farm loan association, and talking about her work there, talking about some of her charity work or her literary work. Um, with her husband, a lot of it is he's a farmer, and so what does that mean? And it's actually kind of cool because he was considered to be this very progressive farm in newspapers where they're like, he's experimenting, and he came into the newspaper office. He has this like, what was it, 6 or 8 foot high stalk of corn because he's actually doing all of these experimentations. So it's all of these things that you never would have even thought of to look for, that it's just these random mentions that, oh yeah, they went out to visit friends. Well, what does that mean in the larger sense? And then I actually have a chapter on DeSmet, and looking at basically, what is it? The long winter and these happy golden years, because Laura Ingalls Wilder describes all of these social events going on, but there's no sense of line. And I actually found newspaper articles that corresponded with what's going on. So I have this mini section on Thanksgiving because I think it's in, I want to say it's in These Happy Years. No, it's in Little Town on the Prairie, where she says, oh, look, it's the first Thanksgiving in South Dakota. And actually, it is. It's a big deal because Thanksgiving was not really recognized in Dakota Territory. And so I'm able to find all of these articles on Thanksgivings around DeSmet and what's going on there. So it really varies. I'm trying to think how many newspaper articles I used. Over 100, definitely. But it's the best part of it, I think, was that nobody's talking about, oh, she's a celebrity, or look at her book just came out. The ones that I'm finding, and the ones, and it's mainly because they're digitized, the newer ones won't be, were all about, look at her place in the community and look at this shrewd businesswoman. It's really cool.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's more of a society pages, kind of current events kind of thing rather than celebrity. And that is interesting that
Yeah.
they kind of picked up on her as an important person before she became kind of hugely famous later on. That is interesting.
Yeah. And so her
Um,
father, so it's the same way with her father. And you get that kind of sense from the books that he's an important person in DeSmet. But when you go into the newspaper articles, you're like, oh, wow, he is passing laws, you know? So it's really cool.
huh. All right. And so then are you supplementing these with like the writings of the family themselves, or did the family, besides Laura, besides the more scholarly bent of Laura and others, but were they leaving behind records that you were using to supplement these, or is it more of just an analysis of the newspaper articles?
So I'm using some of Laura's writings, particularly I use the books, but I also use some articles she wrote in the approximately like 1900 to 1920, when she's actually working as a journalist to help. Um, but a lot of what I'm actually trying to do is triangulate these newspaper articles with other trends that are going around, and how do we see this within the larger development of the American West in the late 19th century and early 20th century, obviously. And so and that's something that other scholars really just haven't done, that they have gone into, oh, look, Carey, for example, kept journals. They've looked at those. And so I wanted to do something a little different and have a different focus.
That's cool. I like that because that was kind of where I was going with this is how, how could this be used as a way to kind of tell the story of the development of the American West?
Mhm.
Because it's on the one hand, you've got, the Little House on the Prairie. This is kind of set up in a lot of popular conceptions as like this, this remote outpost, the
Mhm.
frontier, and all of that. But at the same time, they're surrounded by all these newspapers, as you're saying, that are writing. So it's not like they're out on their own, miles from civilization or anything. They're firmly part of civilization. I think that's kind of goes against a lot of the popular conception of the way the American West developed, especially in that era. People have this mind, in mind that literally the prairie with nothing around, but no,
Yeah.
the West, and this is one of the kind of the trends of American, Western historiography anyway, is kind of the idea that the West has actually always been a fairly industrialized place. It developed at different paces at different places, but for the most part, it's small pockets of almost heavy industrialization in some ways.
Mhm.
And so it's just when you're talking about, the dad, the various industries that these folks were involved with, there's, it sounds like there's still agriculture related um, businesses and developments and all that, but it is still kind of in a much more urbanized, even if it's a small town, it's kind of an urbanized area more than you would expect from the stories.
Yeah, and the chapter I have on DeSmit is really trying to show how much they are part of these major trends that are going on throughout the United States. Part of it is Thanksgiving, that they're actually part of this more nationwide acceptance of Thanksgiving. There's roller skating, there's actually this um like fear about the loose morals of roller skating in DeSmit. And the singing society that Laura Ingalls Wilder becomes a part of in these happy golden years, where she and her future husband, they go and they learn all these songs. It's actually seen as a civilizing thing. Well, that's actually happening everywhere throughout the Dakotas, and it's really expanding. And so it's kind of this like, well, don't go roller skating, go to singing society. So it's really, really fabulous. And I was going through the DeSmit newspaper, and they're talking about early electricity in a time period. Oh, what was it? I think it was the just before Laura Ingalls Wilder got married, so it would have been around 1885, so 1884, 1883. They're talking about bringing electricity to DeSmit and electric lamps and stuff, things that we don't expect for the prairie. So, yeah.
And so I don't know her story very well, and I only have kind of a passing knowledge of the books. I know they're hugely popular, but somehow I missed out on them when I was a kid. But so how, where did the inspiration for the Prairie books? I mean, so I guess I'm trying to figure out, do the books accurately kind of reflect her experience, her lived experience in that area, or were the books just completely fictionalized?
So she said she gave an interview in, I want to say the 30s, in which she said these stories are fiction, but they are all true. And so books were framed, and she and her daughter actually, she wrote the first draft, and then she and her daughter worked through the plots and all. And they decided, and there's a lot of analysis on this, that they decided they were going to focus in on a single family story, the Ingalls family. And so because of that, they had this idea of us against the world that wasn't actually true by any stretch of the imagination. And so because of that, they shape the narrative in a certain way. They also are really trying writing in, so she starts writing late 20s, early 30s. And so they're in the midst of the Great Depression. And so there's this nostalgia for, oh, how things have been. But also people do want that us against the world mentality, because they want to say, look, we can survive, just like the pioneers did. So she does tend to understate the role of technology in her books. It pops out, especially in the later ones, but she does understate it. And that's actually kind of funny because I want to say it was the 1910s, but do not quote me on that date. She wrote this one article for a newspaper, and she's like, I love technology. Like, give me a vacuum any day because that saves me a whole day's work. Give me, a modern sink where I can just turn on a tap and the water comes out versus carrying that water. I love this. This is amazing. I would not go back. But because she's crafting this narrative of survival, she really does underplay the role of technology. It pops up, and you have to do this kind of critical reading because you get caught you get lost in the books of like, oh, they're out on the prairie, they're so alone. And in reality, it's there. It's always behind the scenes.
That really makes me think of a lot of the history of the West, because yeah, it is much more developed than we tend to think it is, and so that's interesting. Um, okay, so this book is going to be coming out next year. We'll have to wait for the 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 story. You have to get more details. If you're going to be a little bit cagey about it, I understand. Um, what do you think will come after that? Any ideas?
I actually was just asked to write two articles. One
Nice.
is on one is on Carlisle, and I have another article planned for after that one's done. And then I was asked to write another article on Catholic sisters at the Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893.
Oh,
I
cool.
have this I have this weird, I've been developing a passion over the past 10-ish years about the World's Fairs. And so someone asked me, hey, I need you to, well, would you please submit to a journal on Catholic sisters? And I'm like, okay, what resources do I have? World Fair, yes. So I have the sources. I just have to write it.
That's very cool. I've been on I've been fascinated with the World's Fair kind of off and on for a couple of decades too. And is this the 1893 World's
Yeah,
Fair in Chicago? Oh,
yeah.
that's very cool. If you tie in Frederick Jackson Turner, then you'll be my hero forever.
Well, you have to mention him somehow.
Well, right. Yeah, the only AHA presentation that ever actually meant anything to the rest of the world.
Very true.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I'm looking forward to that one. Let me know when when that sees the light of day. That'll be awesome.
Hopefully
Okay,
next year.
so yeah, that'd be great. So I figure, actually, at this point, if anybody in the audience has any questions for Dr. Davis, feel free to either start typing into there's a chat box on the right side of the screen that you're welcome to type a question into, or if you're brave and want to just turn on your microphone and come on and talk to us, that would be great. Anybody is welcome to. Um, the while folks are thinking and while it looks like Eric is typing, what types of so you're going to use the same base of sources for these upcoming articles on the sisters that you've been using in the past, or are you using something different?
So some of them are the same because there are references in the boarding schools. So they're representing the boarding schools to the 1893 edition, but most of these are actually going and saying to the sisters' convents and saying, hi, what do you have on the boarding schools in general? And I just saw the question from Eric. No, unfortunately, I haven't come across them. Most of the communities I've come across are very wide and varied. So I haven't come across that nation yet.
So the question there was, did the Penobscot Nation figure into the research and writing at all? So you said there were a bunch of different groups. Which ones were more prominent?
So with the Sisters of St. Joseph, there's the Kachin, and the Kachin are also often called the Yuma. They're along the Colorado River as Arizona meets California. There's the Haudenosaunee. So, for example, the Sisters of Mercy worked New York and actually had a boarding school up in New York with the Mohawk St. Regis, who are part of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, the Five Nations. There's the Ojibwe in Minnesota. There is, I'm now blanking, the Osage, who were in Kansas and then forced to move to Oklahoma. And I've looked at other Oklahoma nations, and they have interesting tensions with the Catholic missionaries. And then when I do research on the Carlisle boarding school, it is all nations. So, for example, I have an article on Catholicism at the Carlisle boarding school, which reviewers went, wait, what? This existed? And I looked at a variety of Native nations.
All right, we've got a question from Kiana. Is there a reason you opted to submit your Laura Ingalls Wilder book to Nebraska instead of the South Dakota Historical Society Press?
So Nebraska is a really great academic press, and the South Dakota also does go through peer review. But I also knew that Nebraska had a book coming out on Laura Ingalls Wilder, which came out about a month before I submitted my manuscript. So I was rewriting as I read this book. And I knew the book that was coming out was priced reasonably well. So my first book, for example, is ridiculously expensive. I had no choice in the matter. Um, the book that just came out too had an audiobook component. I'm a big fan of audiobooks, and I also had a colleague who has published through Nebraska. So I decided to submit to them.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we actually don't spend a whole lot of time in these events when we're talking to authors, and that is an important thing to keep in mind is the selection of the press, because a lot of times we kind of jump to, well, what are the mechanics of converting a manuscript to a public, or how do you
Mhm.
convert a dissertation, for example, to a book manuscript? We talk about kind of those mechanics, but we don't actually talk a whole lot about the selection of publisher, but that can be a hugely important step. Because you need to find a publisher that is, first off, that is willing to publish you, sure. But there's also a lot of, especially in the history world, you want to look for presses that are kind of known for your field, because if you can get published in that, then that's kind of an endorsement of your work.
Mhm.
And in a way, I mean, because if this press is the one that's most affiliated with your topic, and you publish a book there, then that's good. And so,
Mhm.
but also there can be other factors, like you said, like audiobooks and pricing, because yeah, some of these books are amazingly expensive, and others are much more reasonable. And so there's a lot that can go into the decision for where you're going to publish.
Yeah. And for my first book, that decision, I had actually done peer review for them. And so I had been doing peer review, and they said, "Hey, if you ever want to submit a manuscript," I'm like, "Well," and so I had a connection with them. And so it was one of those things where I really wish I had more of a say in the pricing, because the pricing's astronomical.
Yeah, but first monographs, you don't have a whole lot of control over it. But now that you're established, now you can start, making your own terms and all of that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see. There was some other typing happening a minute ago. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Patrick, I'm curious as to how we might use the sources about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family to better understand the ways in people viewed family in the West of her time.
Family
Okay.
relations in general. So um, it's interesting because there is a family history and the history of families in general in the book. And one of the things that I talk about when I talk about Carrie Ingalls is Carrie Ingalls and Grace, who becomes Grace Dow, is relationships between spouses. And so, what are the power relationships as perceived by the press? And that's the big thing, as perceived. That some people have looked at Grace Dow, Grace Ingalls, who kept all these diaries. And that's a completely different narrative from what the newspapers are showing. And so, what is the narrative that the newspapers are showing? There's also things in general about families that pop up in the newspapers. So, fun fact, what is it? By the shores of Silver Lake, Laura meets a cousin of hers, who I think is technically a step cousin. Well, in looking in the newspapers, the cousin was actually involved in an inheritance dispute. And this was a nasty inheritance dispute over who inherited money. And so you see brother against brother, and then the siblings against the mother, and what's going on with that. And this is well documented in the newspapers. So that's one way we can get insight into the families. There were other articles I came across that were not related to the Ingalls family, but had similar names. So, for example, there's a Caroline Ingalls who is accused of murder. It's not Ma Ingalls. It's not Laura Ingalls Wilder's mother. but you can get all of these great examples of like these relationships that go through the courts through the newspapers because the newspapers are actively documenting the courts. So there's a lot of insight you can get through the sources I've been using. And then if you go into diaries and all, you'll get more of these interpersonal relationships.
Interesting, because yeah, that would be a good facet or a good kind of component of it. Because if we're going to be using this to tell the story of kind of this urban versus rural West, then yeah, interesting to put the family component in there also. So that's very cool. And then Kiana, again, as a native North Dakota resident, I can attest that local newspapers were and still are Facebook before Facebook.
Yeah, that's a good way to put them.
Yeah.
And thank you, Julie, for your comment. The 4th of July scene is actually mentioned in the one chapter in the book.
Well, we'll just see if anybody else jumps in. But this has been a very cool conversation, and I look forward to hearing more about the your further adventures as you as you continue to publish here. So you are currently teaching at Lycoming College, is that right? Okay.
Yep,
And are you
information
teaching
literacy.
history there?
Nope, information literacy.
Oh, okay.
So I
Okay.
hold, yeah, so a bit different.
Okay. Well, that probably gives you a bit of a leg up when it comes time to research.
It actually helps a lot because when students are doing research, they think, oh, it's this very linear process and it should be easy. And it's like, no, you're going to throw everything away at some point. And
Right.
so I can talk to them about that and be like, I get it, guys.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time I start a project, all of the assumptions you start with, yeah, they all go out the window because you'll very soon realize that you had no idea what you're actually going to be walking into, and
Yep.
all the methodology that you were unaware of, and all the sources you were unaware of, and all the stuff that you thought was going to be useful turns out to not be useful, and it's one of the amazing yet frustrating kind of realities of the historian. So Kiana has another question. Haven't read your book on the Catholic sisters, but what was the reaction of the sisters involved or the Catholic diocese involved or your local one even? Just curious, since the boarding schools are not always the most flattering topic for the church.
So I'm not Catholic, so I can't talk about the local parishes. But right now, the Catholic Church is going through a what they call it truth and reconciliation. So, for example, Pope Leo, nearly said Pope Francis, and I'm like, wait, nope, he's dead. Pope Leo, the current head of the Catholic Church, just sent back a lot of items that had been sent from the missions to the Vatican, and he just sent those back to Canada. There are a lot of truth and healing commissions. I was actually involved with one of them with people doing similar research where they were saying, okay, well, we need to acknowledge what happened and talk about what happened at the schools. That being said, there are groups that see the schools as the most positive thing out there. There's a group, for example, that has this kind of reading club. And when members do in the group do research, it's all saying how wonderful the schools were. And some of them are survivors of the schools, and they say, well, the reason the schools were great was because I had food and I had warmth, and I didn't have that at home. So this was a good experience. Other members see it in the terms of how, well, we converted people, so this is the best thing. And that's the good that came out of it. If we were to go back to the 19th century, people are talking about the schools and they're praising it. They're like, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, when sliced bread hasn't even been invented yet. Um, and there are actually newspaper articles that will mention it. So I just finished up an article on on an event of anti-Catholic backlash in Pittsburgh, and came across this one article that's like, wow, the Catholics are the ones who are doing the best at the school. They are the best ones at the schools. They need to be funded better. Let's see. Are the return of Catholic remains from Carlisle part of the Catholic Church's mission to reconcile with Native nations? Carlisle was not affiliated. So there were Catholics who worked at Carlisle, but Carlisle was affiliated with the government. So that's actually just part of the federal government's attempt to reconcile with Native nations. Right now, I'm going to emphasize this. I have not heard of the Catholic missions returning students, the remains of students. And the reason for that is because of the idea of what happens after death. So if you're Christian, you are buried on consecrated ground, this ground that's blessed. And if the idea is that if you're not buried on consecrated ground, that your soul will not be able to go to heaven. And so, for example, in what was it, Fort Yuma with the Sisters of St. Joseph, there was a tuberculosis outbreak in 1880, I want to say 1887, and the students are buried on ground. The students who died from tuberculosis are buried on the ground. The Kachin come and they take their students' bodies, and because they say you cannot bury these students, we need to have them buried with our ancestors, and the sisters are furious about that. And so there have been instances where the bodies are reclaimed, but as of right now, I have not heard of, and that's the emphasis, I have not heard of anything to repatriate the remains, particularly in some of the mass graves that we've heard about, where in Canada and the US, that they will just come across a mass grave of students.
I would say that could be an epilogue to a future version of your book, but that may be going a little bit too far forward. Bit of a jump from 1918 to that, I suppose. But
it's mentioned a little bit in an article I have coming out.
I was going to say that might be a good follow-up article at some point too.
Like two different things, the boarding schools and Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah, very different. So this has been a good conversation. Covered a lot of ground, and so I think at this point it's probably about time to wrap things up. It's getting late here on the East Coast, and so I think unless anybody has any further questions, I think we can probably call it a night. I don't see anybody typing anything. Kiana says thank you, so I will go along with that. So thank you. We've been talking to Dr. Elisabeth Davis, who's been talking about her research into the Native American boarding schools and a future project on Laura Ingalls Wilder, and further articles to come after that. So thank you very much for coming and talking to us here, Elisabeth. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians are doing with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Elisabeth Davis, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.